One of the criticisms of the AIIB from the United States, we heard Duncan talk about it a moment ago, is how it will be governed, about whether it'll observe standards on the environment, on labor, on procurement. Has China addressed those concerns? Have those concerns receded?
Well, first of all, the taste of the pudding is in eating it, not in not eating it. And I think it takes good efforts by all the member states, as well as supervision by international media and the relevant governments, for example, to make sure that AIIB will eventually be very well run and have the highest level of transparency and disclosure. And I would say that from the US perspective, having these concerns is one thing, but refusing to join is another thing. And I think this does not reflect well on the US global leadership. For AIIB, for it to be really successful, it needs to live up to the expectation of the 57 member states, and there are about 30 more countries ready to join within 2016. So it's really a very important part of the international global community. And I would say that it would require the management of AIIB, their executive board, all the staff, for example, to really come up with the highest level of governance and standards. And they should not only be at the equal level of the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, but they need to be even higher standards. President Jin Liqun of AIIB said that since AIIB is born in the 21st century, it needs to have the highest standard of the 21st century rather than standards of the 20th century. I truly believe AIIB will truly be exemplary in this regard.
Samir, does India believe that to be the case as well? I mean, these concerns that were expressed by the United States, do they have any kind of validity in your view, in India's view, and were they discussed by India at all when it was considering joining the bank?
So we were having these discussions with colleagues from China on another bank that is about to give its first disbursement in 2016, which is the new development bank of the BRICS. And I think we had similar conversations there. And I think there are three things the Asian Infrastructure Bank could do better. The first, being a 21st century bank, as was mentioned by Victor, it need not build the same kind of bureaucracy which is infamous in the Bretton Woods institutions. And it could be a bank of banks where it could create local partnerships with local banks and use their information and know-how in management of the financial processes. The second, of course, is a far greater degree of agency that should be given to those who come to seek funding and financing. And in that sense, if it can become more plural and democratic in including the sensitivities of local communities, local governments, and indeed various national capitals, it would have gone a notch higher. And finally, of course, there would always be a suspicion, which would probably be dispelled only in time, that does this have an element of politics? And I'm sure it does. I mean, let's be very clear. One of the key fundamental messages coming out of the Asian Infrastructure Bank is that China is now ready to be part of the rule-making process. And there is an element of politics, and some of the smaller neighbors may be a little disturbed, but it is something that China will have to be careful about, and I'm sure the Chinese will do that. They will be magnanimous, they will be generous, and they will allow enough political space to others even as they follow their own objectives, both political and economic.
Peter, to what extent was this about politics? Was the United States concerned that there's going to be another player at the table right now and someone who's going to be also writing the rules?
Well, my personal belief is that I think the initial US concerns about governance standards were to a large extent politically influenced. How true this is, how valid those concerns will turn out to be, time will tell. I think at this point all we can say is that the way the Articles of Agreement have been formulated, the staff has been selected, the initial staff, which is still quite small, suggests that the intention is to pursue very high standards of governance. Since this is conceived as a project financing agency, more or less along the lines of the AIIB and the World Bank, it's important to note that the appointment of the chief executive of this new bank, in this case Mr. Chin Lichun, is being confirmed as the first initial president, is a merit-based appointment, which is very different from World Bank or IMF, where such criteria are not specified in the Articles of Agreement.
Duncan, to what extent was the establishment of the bank driven by the fact that existing institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank, were not adequately serving the interests of developing countries in Asia?
That's a very tough question. I think certainly there is a shortfall between the aspirations for infrastructure development in Asia and what was actually happening on the ground. I mean, the ADB itself, I believe, has said that there are about $8 trillion worth of infrastructure projects that Asia needs to get financed in the next few years. That's obviously a huge amount of money, and there's a big role that the multilateral institutions need to play in that. I think on one level, you have seen the World Bank and the ADB in particular getting much more cautious about funding a lot of big infrastructure projects because of environmental concerns and because of the communities on the ground that are affected by it. And as those concerns are being given added weight through political scandals that have come back on these institutions in the past, that has slowed down the pace of development. In addition to that, you have a lot of capacity issues on the ground in the countries that need this investment. Let's face it, you know, if you're dealing with very poor countries, their ability to lead an infrastructure project that involves billions of dollars is going to be somewhat limited. So there are these problems that have held the institutions back. But I think also there is a strong argument to be made that more could be done if there was a greater will on the ground to do it. And I think it's notable that you have seen a number of governments in Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, for example, where you have seen a renewed commitment to infrastructure investment from new administrations. So I think in that sort of respect, the arrival of the AIIB is very timely. And, you know, provided that the politics on the ground in these countries is conducive, there is, I think, a strong opportunity for the AIIB to accelerate the development of infrastructure in the region.
Victor, if we look at regional membership, if the AIIB around the world, if we look at Africa, China is hugely involved in Africa right now, but why so few African countries in the AIIB? At the moment, I think it's just Egypt and South Africa.
Definitely. Right now, these are the two African countries who are also members of the AIIB. I think since AIIB is principally committed to infrastructure and connectivity projects in Asia, it's understandable that few countries from Africa have signed up for AIIB, partially because in Africa there is also a huge demand for funding in the infrastructure sector, and China has played important roles in working together with many African countries in this particular regard. And I think China will continue to be very much involved in working with the African brothers and sisters in this particular regard going forward. AIIB is mostly for Asia, and the fact that many European countries, developed countries, have become members of AIIB indicate very well that they are wise enough to not only commit to the funding of the infrastructure projects in Asia, but they also expect to benefit from this, because in the coming few decades, there will be huge surge of investments in infrastructure in the Asian region. I hope eventually, with Africa becoming more and more developed, there will be more African countries who eventually will consider becoming members of AIIB, but it may take some time.
Samir, you mentioned the BRICS nations. Of course, they're establishing their own development bank, but how important is the AIIB for BRICS countries?
Not necessarily for the BRICS countries, but for India, certainly. I think I have always argued that India has two large projects it needs to complete. The first is the 20th century project of building large infrastructure, roads, ports, and all sorts of other facilities for its people. And it's unlikely that Western institutions today have the appetite to be able to fund that. Alongside the lack of appetite, there is now a very definitive sustainable development agenda which precludes lending to certain activities. And if AIIB can step in and meet both the need and the variety of funding that India needs, it is extremely important for India. I do not see other than, say, East Asian economies like Korea, Japan, and China, any other country having both the inclination and capacity to invest in the kind of development that India requires. So I think for India, it is certainly a huge opportunity if we can get the politics right.
Peter, as I mentioned, the US is not a member of the AIIB, neither are Canada, Japan, Mexico. Are they likely to join soon, down the road?
Well, the invitation to join is open. What will happen, I don't know, but I certainly hope that the membership will broaden. We start with 57 member countries. We've been told that there are at least another 30 countries, many in Africa, that are contemplating joining. I think it would be a good idea for the US to join. And if the US join, there is a high probability that Japan and Mexico and Canada will also join.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. You'll find that at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.